Hello, my name is Joy Wilkie, and I'm a data scientist on the survey science team here at CivisAnalytics. We are an analytics company that's based in Chicago. And today I'm going to be talking about some research that we've done looking at how the way that you ask for consent to collect personally identifiable information can shape who decides to participate in your survey and what their attitudes are. So in today's talk, I'm going to begin with a brief outline. We'll go over the motivation for this. So why do we conduct this research to begin with? And specifically, the research question that we're asking is, what's the best way to collect PII in this changing privacy landscape? Next, I'll walk through the data. And basically, to answer this question, we ran an experiment in which we varied the consent language that we used, the sponsor of the survey, and the placement of the consent language. Next, I'll walk you all through the results. And basically, we found that consent language and sponsor of the survey can impact the consent rate, the drop-off rate, and the response distributions. And finally, we'll just wrap up with a conclusion. But if you don't take anything else away from today's talk, I want you to take away this TLDR, which is that survey sponsor can change who decides to participate in the survey. Strategic placement of consent language can mitigate this to a certain extent. And longer consent languages do get more agreement, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. So why do we work on this project? I don't think I need to tell the people in the room here that there are a lot of new regulations that researchers, people in tech, people in survey research are facing. And there are these regulations like GDPR, CCPA, and other regulations that are under consideration are aimed at giving individuals a lot more privacy and control over their data and the data that companies can collect from them. One of the requirements is that we may need to start asking explicitly for consent to collect personally identifiable information, or PII. A lot of our surveys do ask this type of ask to collect this type of information. So we, in almost all of, or in at least half of our surveys, we collect things like name, email address, birth date, zip code. All of this falls under the broad definition of personal information, and we use this in survey research to match respondents back to the voter file, so that we can get a little bit more background info on an individual's vote history, other types of information. And we have, as careful researchers, we're concerned about how any changes in our data collection process might impact the data quality that the quality of the data that we're collecting. Specifically, we're worried about an increase in non-response bias, or this idea that individuals who decide not to participate in our surveys are significantly different from individuals who decide to participate in our surveys. And we wanted to make sure, we started working on this research because we wanted to make sure that we know how, before we implemented any changes, how those changes might impact the types of people who decide to take our surveys and what they think and what they report to us. So to get at that, we asked specifically, how does asking for consent to collect PII affect survey estimates? And to answer this question, we ran an experiment in which we varied the consent language we used, the placement of that consent language, and the sponsor of the survey who was disclosed in that consent language section. So in a little bit more detail, the consent language that we used, there were 3 different types of language that we tested. We used our control language, which is basically what we've been using for a long time. It's 4 sentences. We don't disclose who's sponsoring the survey. And we just ask respondents to click this little next arrow rather than explicitly consenting. Now, in the 2 different variations of this consent language, we either had 3 paragraphs, in those paragraphs we disclosed who the sponsor was. And then we asked respondents to explicitly consent to participating. Or in the longer version, it was 8 paragraphs, and it's the same 3 paragraphs intro and then just 5 additional paragraphs tacked on. And then you basically would have to scroll down to get to the end and to press that consent button. Now we also varied the placement of that consent language either at the beginning or the end of the survey. And finally, we varied the sponsor. So we had 3 different sponsors who we disclosed. The idea between these 3 sponsors is that Planned Parenthood for America and the National Rifle Association tend to be affiliated with the political left and the political right. We were interested in seeing how having a liberal group and a conservative group might impact who is more likely to drop off in our surveys. Then finally, we had this 3rd sponsor, this fictional organization, the Bipartisan Research Institute. Obviously, because they're fictional, they're not going to have name ID like PPFA or the NRA do. But we just wanted to have a comparison point, a more neutral, a more bipartisan, yet still political sponsor to see how that might impact things as well. So here are the conditions kind of laid out in tabular format. Basically, there are 14 different treatment conditions, and I'm not going to walk you through each one, because that would take more than 20 minutes that I have here. But what we see, I just wanted to lay it out in a little bit more detail. So the consent language is either at the beginning or the end. You would see one of these 3 consent languages, and then in the long and short consent language conditions, you would see one of 3 sponsors. And to do this research, we collected about 2,300 responses and an additional 700 partial responses. And we fielded this in October through a marketplace of online panels, which is our standard protocol at Civis. So one important takeaway is that the overall consent rate is quite high. Most respondents do consent to PII collection when asked. We saw like a 96% consent rate, only 3.5% refused, and about a half percentage point dropped off at that page and just decided, this isn't for me. And importantly, there aren't any main effects of these 3 treatment conditions. So length alone, sponsor alone, placement alone didn't have any impact on a key metric that we're going to be using throughout this presentation, which is the percent complete and consent. So in the control length condition, 77% of respondents completed the survey. That was basically the same in the long or short conditions. There, 77% to 74%. It's not a significant difference. Same with the sponsor and the placement. But we do see some important interactions between the sponsor of the survey, the position, and length. So digging into that a little bit more. Here in this table, this first row, no sponsor and placement at the beginning of the survey, the consent and completion rate. So that's our control condition, right? That's our baseline. That's what we do generally at Civis. So our consent and completion rate is about 79%. That drops a little bit, although it's not a significant difference when that's asked at the end, or it's at the end. And again, no significant differences when the sponsor is the bipartisan group, Bipartisan Research Institute. But things get interesting when we get down to how individual survey respondents react when the sponsor is the NRA or PPFA. So there, what we see is that for the NRA, whether the consent language is at the beginning or the end of the survey, the consent and completion rate significantly drops to 72, 73%. And again, we see a similar thing when the sponsor is Planned Parenthood, especially when that consent language is placed at the end of the survey. The consent and completion rate drops 10 points from the control condition. So a pretty big and statistically significant effect here. on that interaction between sponsor and placement. And again, what we digging into where that drop-off is happening, a lot of it seems to be coming from political independence. So in this table, we have, just looking at the sponsor, across the x-axis, we have the control, BRI, the NRA, and PPFA. And then the bars indicate the partisanship of the individual survey respondent. What we see is that in the control condition, there's really no significant differences in the consent and completion rate across the different partisan groups. But we do see some significant changes when the sponsor is political in nature, and especially when that group is partisan in nature. So independents really start to drop off when the sponsor is BRI, but especially when the sponsor is NRA or PPFA, independents say like, hey, you know, this isn't for me. I don't want to finish this survey. One possible reason this might be is something that we know from previous research about political independence is that they tend to be just less interested in politics on average. So perhaps it feels, you know, a little bit like a sign up. They're worried about being put on a list, or they just don't want to talk about politics. All of these are potential reasons that we really see this impact among independents. And that differential drop-off has some really important effects on the distribution of survey responses. So I'm sorry to throw this like ugly regression table at you, but I wanted to just kind of get this across. I wanted to get a lot of information across. So what we see here, it's 4 different regressions, basically support for the Democratic candidate, support for Trump, Planned Parenthood favorability, or NRA favorability. And then in the rows are the different, you know, coefficients. So either the no sponsor, BRI, NRA, or PPFA. What we see is there aren't really any significant different effects of sponsor when the sponsor is BRI or the NRA, but when the sponsor is Planned Parenthood, we see some pretty big impacts on support and increased support for the Democratic candidate and decreased in NRA favorability. So it's just kind of a rough measure, a quick cut getting at how sponsor might impact not only who decides to take your survey on the previous slide, but also the response distribution of people who do end up taking your survey. Okay, so next I want to talk about the interaction between position and sponsor on the refusal rate. So what we see here is that we're switching to a slightly different metric here. So instead of the consent and completion rate, I'm just looking at refusal on that question. What we see is that when the sponsor is at the beginning of the survey, when the consent language is asked at the beginning of the survey, sponsor doesn't have a big impact. But when it's asked at the end of the survey, especially for Planned Parenthood, that created a big increase in the refusal rate. So the refusal rate jumped from like 3% to about 6%. So I think it's one word of warning is that particularly if you have a sponsor who might be a little bit more polarizing, better to disclose that early on rather than at the end. And again, I don't have data to shine a light on why this happens. I can only have a guess. My guess is that it feels a little bit like a sign up when it's asked at the end, and people, you know, particularly independents, may think, oh, I just took this political survey that I wasn't really into, and now Planned Parenthood wants to collect my data. I don't want this. So one potential reason why, again, just a hypothesis, don't have any data to back that up. All right, so getting towards the end here, but basically what we see in this slide is the effect of the length of the consent language on that consent and completion rate. What we see in the control condition, the consent and completion rate was, you know, pretty high, about 88%. Now that drops to 85% in the long condition, and 23% in the short consent language condition. Now, maybe that might indicate to some people, oh, we should use this long consent language rather than the short consent language because it gets a higher consent and completion rate. But I'm not sure that's the most ethical thing to do. And the reason for that is it doesn't really seem like respondents are actually reading that consent language. So they are, on this graph, we're showing the average time, on that page where respondents are reading. We collected some metadata on that question, and we have the average time before respondent hit submit on this question. And the average time for the long consent language is, significantly longer than either the control or the short consent language. But it's not long at all. It's still, on average, only 25 seconds. This consent language, the long one, is 424 words. You really have to scroll to get to the bottom of it. The average American only reads about 200 words per minute. So there's really no way that in 25 seconds on average, people are reading this long consent language. The short consent language, on the other hand, 160 words, still probably not reading that whole thing. They're really potentially they're reading all the words in the control condition, but definitely respondents were not reading all 424 words in just 25 seconds, which I think is fair. Like, I never read the consent language when I'm asked things, when I sign up for things. So I certainly don't blame respondents for this. So finally, just wrapping up. Overall, most respondents did consent to the collection of PII, but drop-offs and refusals are not random, and it can impact the distribution of survey responses in really important ways, especially when that sponsor is polarizing, and it may bias your survey estimates. Placing consent language, when you have polarizing sponsors, placing consent language at the beginning can help fix this. But longer consent language does get a higher consent rate, but most respondents aren't reading this longer language. So that's on you if it's ethical or not. That's an individual decision to make. So again, I just want to highlight the TLDR one more time. In case you've been sleeping through the past 20 minutes, that's fine. This is what you should take away. The sponsor of a survey does change who decides to participate. Placing that consent language at the beginning of the survey rather than at the end can mitigate this effect to a certain extent. And longer consent language does get more agreement, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. So that's it. Thank you all so much for your time, and I really look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thanks so much.